My name is Elias Thorne. I am 34 years old. I live in a minimalist apartment in Seattle, overlooking the gray churn of the Puget Sound. I work as a senior systems architect for a mid-sized cybersecurity firm. My life is defined by logic, sequence, and risk assessment. I do not experience panic. I do not understand hysteria. I believe that every problem has a structural failure point, and every failure point has a corresponding administrative solution. My father, Richard, stood in my entryway holding a cardboard box taped with cheap masking tape. He was shaking. His lower lip moved in an erratic, uncoordinated rhythm. He told me that my stepbrother, Julian, had changed the locks on the family estate while he was at the podiatrist. He said Julian had legal documents declaring him incompetent. Julian had evicted him. This was the peak of his humiliation. I watched him stand there, weeping over his ruined life, and my first instinct was to check the timestamp on my security server logs. I did not offer him a hug. I offered him a seat on a chair that cost exactly $850 because of its lumbar support. I asked him for the deed transfer paperwork. He didn't have it. He thought he had signed a simple power of attorney document 3 months ago. He hadn't. He had signed a total asset divestment agreement. I analyzed the situation in 3 seconds. He had been tricked, systematically and with surgical precision, by the boy he had spoiled for 20 years. I looked at the water outside my window. The tide was coming in, erasing the shoreline. I looked back at my father. He smelled like stale tobacco and desperation. He expected me to be angry for him. He expected me to scream at Julian or storm the house. But anger is a resource drain. It clouds the objective. I looked at my laptop screen, where 4 different subnetworks were running live integrity checks. I did not feel rage. I felt a cold, sharp clarity. If you were in my shoes, would you open your home to someone who had ignored your existence for over a decade, or would you point them toward the nearest hotel? This was not just about my father's eviction. It was about the structural integrity of my own life. I had spent 15 years building a fortress of professional and financial independence. Now, the chaotic influence of my family had breached the perimeter. I needed to assess the damage before I could initiate a countermeasure. Richard married Elena when I was 12 years old. Julian was 10. Almost immediately, the family dynamic shifted into a rigid hierarchy of utility and affection. I was the utility. Julian was the affection. Richard saw me as a logistical resource to be tapped. He saw Julian as a legacy to be polished. Julian broke things. I was expected to pay to fix them. When I was 22, Richard borrowed exactly $12,400 from my college savings fund for Julian's failed restaurant venture. It was a fusion taco truck that lasted precisely 6 weeks. I never saw that money again. I never asked for it back because I knew the return on investment for that conversation would be zero. My career trajectory began to accelerate. I specialized in infrastructure security. I learned how to identify vulnerabilities in complex systems. Richard's career began to stagnate. He managed real estate holdings that were slowly bleeding cash. Whenever I achieved a professional milestone, it was dismissed as a matter of luck. Whenever Julian failed, it was categorized as a learning opportunity. The dynamic was a classic parasite-host relationship. I was the host. They were the parasites. I was the one who covered his medical bypass surgery deductible of $4,300 in 2019. I was the one who bought his luxury sedan when his credit score dropped below 580. They treated my success as a collective asset. They viewed my professional boundaries as a personal insult. Last year, when I refused to co-sign a $50,000 loan for Julian's tech startup, they stopped speaking to me for 6 months. They did not call for birthdays. They did not call for holidays. They only called when the systems I had helped maintain began to collapse. Now, Richard was sitting in my living room, expecting me to fix the catastrophic failure of his own making. He had built a life predicated on the assumption that I would always be there to reset the server. He assumed that because I was his son, I was obligated to provide unlimited bandwidth to his problems. He was wrong. I was not there to restore his previous configuration. I was there to perform a complete system wipe. He did not know it yet, but the era of the extraction was over. Richard was asleep in my guest bedroom. I went to my office and closed the door. This room is a Faraday cage. It is shielded against electromagnetic interference. My monitors hummed with the quiet intensity of a high-frequency trading server. Julian believed he was the smartest person in the room. He thought in terms of blunt force. He bullied his way into ownership of the estate. He had no idea I was running deep packet inspection on his digital footprint. 3 years ago, I installed a home automation system for Richard. It was a standard smart home package with custom firmware I wrote myself. I gave it a backdoor. It was a precautionary measure against the inevitable incompetence of my family. I had full administrative control over every connected device in their house. I had been logging every keystroke on the estate's main server for exactly 36 months. I opened my secure partition. It contained 4.2 terabytes of metadata. I had copies of every email Julian sent to the estate lawyers. I had digital transcripts of his financial negotiations. I had hidden invoices showing he had been funneling money out of Richard's account since 2021. He had moved $45,000 into offshore crypto wallets. He thought he was clever. He was using a simple mixer service that I had already de-anonymized last quarter. Most people see a computer and think of entertainment. I see a ledger. I see a trail of breadcrumbs leading to a trap. I had been quietly documenting his fraud for years. I didn't save these files for blackmail. I saved them as insurance. Now, that insurance policy was about to pay out in full. I did not need to shout or fight. I only needed to present the data to the right stakeholders. I navigated to the folder labeled Project Julian. I verified the integrity of the checksums. Everything was clean. Everything was ready. The file structure was organized by chronological severity. I had enough evidence to trigger a forensic audit that would freeze all of Julian's assets within 24 hours. My hands were steady as I typed the command to mirror the data to an off-site, immutable cloud storage bucket. I was ready to execute the severance. The sun hadn't crested the horizon yet. Richard was still asleep in my guest room, unaware that his entire digital infrastructure was about to go dark. I sat at my console, my fingers poised over the mechanical keyboard. The air in my apartment was filtered and cooled to a precise 68 degrees. It was time to execute the severance. For 5 years, I had been the primary account holder for the family security monitoring subscription, the high-end cloud storage services, and the recurring cloud-based backups for the estate. These were small line items individually, totaling roughly $182.40 a month. But they were the central nervous system of their daily operation. I navigated to the billing portal. I did not hesitate. I initiated a full-service termination. The screen flashed a standard warning about potential data loss. I clicked Confirm without reading the text. Next, I accessed the Smart Home Hub. I had full administrative privileges over the estate's lighting, temperature, and security protocols. Julian had locked Richard out, but he had not accounted for the master override that I had embedded in the system architecture. I initiated a remote factory reset. The system wiped every customized setting, every security code, and every biometric permission. From that moment on, the house was a brick. The smart locks would default to their manufacturing state. They would require a manual key to open. Julian did not have the key. He would be locked out of the house he had stolen. My third action was financial. I checked the joint credit line that I had mistakenly allowed to remain open for emergencies. The current balance was $14,200. I initiated a dispute for every transaction over the last 90 days that originated from Julian's IP address. I tagged them as unauthorized access. This would trigger an automatic freeze on the card by the bank's fraud department. The freeze would be absolute. It would block all future transactions until a formal investigation was completed. That investigation would take exactly 14 business days. I stood up and walked to the kitchen. I poured a glass of filtered water. The silence in the apartment was heavy, but it was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of a clean system. I had not fired a shot or screamed a word. I had simply retracted the resources that Julian had been using to sustain his fraudulent claim of power. He was an engineer of chaos, but he was illiterate in the language of administration. He was about to find out that a house without a foundation cannot support its own weight. I watched the clock. It was 6:02 a.m. The automated systems would begin to fail within the next few minutes. The process had begun. The notifications on my secondary monitor started pinging at 7:15 a.m. It was a cascade of error reports from the estate. The security system was triggering a hardware-level lockdown. The temperature control in the main server room was spiking. Julian was likely screaming at a wall of unresponsive touchscreens. My phone vibrated on the marble island. The caller ID displayed Julian. I let it ring twice. I finished my coffee. I picked up the phone. Elias, what the hell did you do? Julian's voice was high-pitched, vibrating with raw, unmitigated panic. He was shouting so loudly that the audio peaked in my receiver. I am currently looking at the diagnostic logs of the estate, I said. My voice was level, calibrated to be devoid of inflection. It appears your local network is experiencing a total system failure. This usually happens when the administrative credentials are revoked from the central server. You locked me out. The front door is deadbolt. The alarm is blaring, and I can't turn it off because the app says the account doesn't exist. He was pacing. I could hear his shoes scuffing on the hardwood. Unlock it right now, you sociopath. This is illegal. You can't just shut down a residential security system. I'm going to call the police. I'm going to tell them you're hacking our property. You are welcome to call the police, I replied. However, keep in mind that I am the registered account holder for all utility and security contracts. I am simply reclaiming my hardware assets due to an unauthorized change in property occupancy. If you call them, they will likely just ask you for proof of ownership. Do you have that, Julian? Because the last time I checked, the deed was tied up in a probate dispute that you initiated. There was a silence on the other end. He was breathing heavily, trying to process the logic. He couldn't. He tried a different tactic. He shifted from threats to the classic guilt trip maneuver. Mom would be ashamed of you, he hissed. You're destroying our family over a stupid house. Do you know how much this is hurting Richard? He's an old man. Richard is currently sitting in my kitchen eating oatmeal, I said. He is not hurt. He is inconvenienced. There is a distinct difference. Fix it, Julian demanded, his voice dropping into a dangerous, ragged register. If you don't fix this in 10 minutes, I am going to contact your employer. I will tell them you've been using company infrastructure to conduct illegal surveillance on private citizens. I will ruin your career. I have already documented that conversation, I replied. I look forward to the audit. I hung up. I did not feel a rush of adrenaline. I felt the steady, rhythmic pulse of a process operating within parameters. The escalation was proceeding exactly as predicted. Julian was foolish to threaten my career. My career is not a vulnerability. It is a bunker. I logged into my company's secure forensic interface. I needed to assemble a comprehensive dossier that would render his threats obsolete. I opened the encrypted drive labeled Case 449B, which contained the digital footprint of the estate's last 3 years. This was where the procedural work began. I did not work from memory. I worked from raw data. I pulled the transaction history for the estate's LLC, which Julian had been managing since he took charge. I cross-referenced the IP addresses of every withdrawal with the geolocation data of his primary mobile device. There were 147 separate instances where money was moved to his personal account while the device was located at a high-end golf club or a local casino, not the estate office. The total amount embezzled was $118,492.14. Every transaction had a timestamp. Every transaction had a digital signature. I then parsed the emails he had sent to the estate's legal counsel. He had forged Richard's signature on the asset divestment agreement. I used a simple document forensic tool to compare the vector paths of the signature on the forged deed with a verified signature from a mortgage application dated 2018. The variance was 14.3%. It was a statistical impossibility for the same human hand to produce that level of discrepancy. It was a digital forgery, likely created using a cheap tablet stylus. I screenshotted the overlay. It was undeniable proof of fraud. The receipts were piling up. I compiled everything into a single, indexed PDF file. I labeled it Forensic Audit, Estate Mismanagement and Fraudulent Inducement. I encrypted it with a 256-bit key. I didn't send it yet. I wanted to wait until he was fully committed to his own destruction. I wanted him to believe he still had leverage. I looked at the clock. It was 10:30 a.m. My apartment was quiet, but my screen was a chaotic dashboard of exposed lies. I felt a slight tightening in my chest, not of emotion, but of focus. This was the analytical equivalent of a sniper waiting for the wind to die down. I had all the components. I had the motive, the method, and the opportunity. Julian was playing a game of emotional warfare. I was playing a game of administrative architecture. I checked my firewall logs. Julian was trying to ping my home network from a public Wi-Fi hotspot. He was still trying to hack his way back in. He didn't realize that by trying to breach my perimeter, he was actively confirming his guilt. Every failed login attempt was logged, timestamped, and geotagged. He was handing me more evidence with every keystroke. He was desperate. I was simply waiting for the inevitable systemic collapse. At 2 p.m., my building security notified me of a visitor. It was Julian. He had bypassed the lobby reception by tailgating a courier. He was standing outside my unit, looking disheveled. His shirt was untucked, and his tie was crooked. He was not alone. He had brought along a man in a cheap suit, carrying a leather briefcase. This was his version of intimidation. He thought a legal prop would force me to open the door. I looked through the camera. I did not unlock it. "Elias, open the door," he called out. His voice was strained, hitting a higher pitch than earlier. "We just want to talk. We can fix this like adults. There is no need for this to go any further." I spoke through the intercom. The microphone was high fidelity. It captured every tremor in his voice. "I am recording this conversation, Julian. Please state your business." "This is ridiculous," the man in the cheap suit interjected. He held up a document. "I'm Julian's attorney. We have a cease and desist regarding your interference with the estate's utility contracts. If you don't restore access, we will pursue immediate civil action for damages." I analyzed the document through the camera lens. It was a template. It had no seal, no court docket number, and the font was inconsistent. It was an amateur fabrication. I didn't even dignify it with a verbal rebuttal. "The cease and desist is invalid," I said. "You are trespassing on private property. If you do not leave, I will contact building security and have you escorted off the premises." Julian's face flushed a deep, mottled red. He dropped the act of the calm negotiator. "Elias, stop this. I will give you back the $12,400 from your college fund. I'll add another $5,000 for your trouble. Just reset the servers. Let us back into the accounts. We can wipe the logs, and no one will ever know what happened." He was offering a bribe. He was confessing to the embezzlement in real time, on a recorded line, in front of a witness. He thought he was negotiating a truce. He was actually providing the final piece of evidence I needed. The audit was now complete. The narrative of his guilt was airtight. "The offer is rejected," I stated. You have 2 minutes to exit the hallway. He started pounding on the door. It was a rhythmic, pathetic thudding. He was losing control of his physiological response to stress. I walked to my workstation. I did not engage. I simply waited for security to arrive. When the guards finally reached the floor, the interaction was clinical. Julian was escorted out, still shouting about his rights. I didn't watch him leave. I went back to my screens. The false truce had failed. The endgame was now inevitable. The next morning, Julian held a town hall meeting at the community center in our hometown. He had invited extended family and longtime friends of my father. He clearly intended to paint me as the unstable, tech-obsessed aggressor. He wanted to secure their sympathy before he moved to lock me out of the family assets permanently. It was a classic miscalculation. He assumed the audience would prioritize family bonds over raw, irrefutable data. I arrived precisely at 10 a.m. The room smelled like stale coffee and cheap floor wax. Julian stood on a small riser near the front. He looked confident, having successfully played the victim for the last 48 hours. He was in the middle of a prepared speech about unreasonable, cold-hearted behavior when I walked through the double doors. I was not there to yell. I was there to present. I carried a slim, carbon fiber laptop and a portable laser projector. I walked to the center of the room. I did not acknowledge Julian's existence. I plugged my device into the overhead input port. The room went silent. They were confused by the lack of emotion in my posture. I did not look like a man seeking vengeance. I looked like a man delivering a quarterly report. Before we discuss family matters, I announced, my voice amplified by the room's PA system, we should address the financial health of the estate. Julian tried to step in front of the projector. Elias, get out of here. You have no right to be here. I bypassed him, pointing the laser at the screen. I displayed the spreadsheet of the $118,492.14 in embezzled funds. I showed the digital fingerprints linking his devices to every offshore crypto transaction. I pulled up the side-by-side comparison of the forged signature on the deed. It was a forensic autopsy of his greed. If you were sitting in that audience, watching a man's carefully constructed lie crumble into a series of ugly, undeniable numbers, would you still feel pity for him, or would you feel disgusted? The room erupted into confused murmurs. I scrolled through the records at a steady, deliberate pace. I didn't editorialize. I didn't insult him. I let the documentation speak for itself. The math was not subject to debate. It was not a matter of perspective. It was simply the truth. Julian looked at the screen, then at the crowd. His skin turned the color of damp parchment. He tried to speak, but the words failed him. The evidence was too dense, too organized, and too perfect to be refuted. He was standing in front of his peers, exposed as a petty thief who had tried to steal from his own father. The aftermath was not a chaotic explosion. It was a precise, systemic dismantling of Julian's life. Within 48 hours of the town hall meeting, the fallout moved from social ostracization to legal catastrophe. I forwarded the entire audit package, including the time-stamped metadata and the digital forensics, to the local district attorney's office. I did not need to file a complaint. The evidence was self-executing. The estate assets were frozen by a court order on Thursday morning. The accounts holding the embezzled $118,492.14 were seized as part of an active fraud investigation. Julian lost his access to the credit lines he had been living on. His credit score, which I had monitored via a third-party reporting service, plummeted from a respectable 720 to a catastrophic 490 in less than a week. It was a spectacular evaporation of status. His employer, a regional logistics firm, performed a routine background check as part of a quarterly compliance audit. They found the open criminal investigation into his financial misconduct. They terminated his contract immediately. He lost his health insurance, his company vehicle, and his salary of $78,000 per year. He was effectively unemployed and unemployable in his industry. The house he had tried to steal was now the property of the state's probate court, pending a full audit of the deed transfer. He could not live there. He could not sell it. He could not even enter the driveway without violating a restraining order my father, with my legal guidance, had filed. He called me repeatedly during this collapse. I did not answer. I reviewed his calls on my logs. He tried 24 times over 3 days. Each time, his desperation was audible in the voicemail transcriptions. He started by threatening me. Then he pleaded for money. Finally, he asked where he could sleep. I felt nothing. It was the same sensation one feels when watching a corrupted drive partition successfully reformat. The system had purged the error. The trash had been taken out. I returned to my work, focusing on a new encryption protocol for my client's network. The issue was resolved. The estate was secure. My father was back in control, and I was back in the silence of my own life. My father returned to his house 6 months later, after the probate court cleared the fraudulent liens. He is living in a simplified version of his previous life. He sold the estate and moved into a manageable condo in the suburbs. He sends me an email every third Sunday. I read them, archive them, and do not respond. He is a variable I have successfully solved and isolated. The drama is over. The system is stable. I return to my routines. I optimized the security stack for my firm's largest client, a contract worth $1.2 million annually. I bought a new espresso machine, a manual lever model that requires absolute precision to pull a perfect shot. It is my only indulgence. My apartment remains quiet. The Puget Sound remains gray and indifferent. I do not look back at the mess Julian made of his life. When you strip away the emotional noise, revenge is not a chaotic event. It is an administrative necessity. It is the logical correction of an error. I did not win because I was stronger than Julian. I won because I was more consistent. I documented the inputs. I controlled the variables. I executed the outcome. Julian was a glitch in the software of our family, and I simply hit the reset button. He is living in a studio apartment in a different city, working shifts at a warehouse. He has no assets, no reputation, and no way to manipulate the people around him. The asymmetry is total. I have gained peace, and he has gained the consequences of his own design. It is a fair trade. If you had the power to systematically dismantle the people who treated your kindness like a weakness, would you pull the trigger, or would you let the system eventually fail on its own? I pour my espresso. The steam rises in a steady, thin line against the cold glass of my window. The logic of my life is sound. There are no more bugs to fix. There are no more audits to perform. I am satisfied.